The restaurant was quiet in the early evening, the kind of silence that feels almost heavy, as if the walls themselves are waiting for the night to begin. The waitress adjusted her apron, brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, and looked around the polished tables, each one shining under the warm lights, ready for the guests who would soon arrive. She had worked here for a while, and though the pay was decent, the job itself often felt repetitive. She served drinks, carried plates, and smiled at strangers who came and went. What most people didn't know, not her manager, not the other waiters, was that she spoke perfect Japanese. Years ago she had studied abroad, worked hard to master the language, and even though life had brought her back to this ordinary job, the skill stayed with her, tucked away like a hidden secret. She never really thought it would matter here, in a place where the most exciting thing was usually a birthday party or a rich customer leaving a big tip. That night was different, though she didn't know it yet. It started like any other evening. She polished glasses, carried baskets of bread to the kitchen, and laughed at a small joke from the chef. Outside the windows the city buzzed. Expensive cars humming down the streets, neon lights blinking on as the sun dipped lower, and inside, the tables were being set for something unusual. Her manager told her in a hushed voice that a very important guest would be arriving, someone wealthy, someone famous in the business world, a billionaire, the kind of man who made headlines and signed deals worth more money than she could imagine. She nodded politely, though inside she wondered what kind of person lived like that. She had seen her share of powerful people, businessmen, politicians, even celebrities passing through, but billionaires carried a different weight. Their presence seemed to change the air in a room. When he arrived, she noticed it immediately. The man walked with an arrogance that seemed practiced, every step slow, measured, as though he wanted everyone to know he was in control. His suit was flawless, tailored to perfection. His watch gleamed under the lights, and his smile, though polite, carried a hint of superiority, as if he believed the world bent itself to his will. Behind him came two associates, men who looked tired, careful, and perhaps even a little nervous. They followed him, like shadows, pulling out chairs and waiting for instructions. The waitress greeted them with the usual grace, offering menus, pouring water, and making sure the table felt attended to. The billionaire barely looked at her, his eyes scanning the room instead. He seemed restless, tapping his fingers on the table as though he had bigger things on his mind than the food. His associates whispered in low voices, checking briefcases and glancing at their watches. It wasn't the first time she had served men like this, but something about him made her uneasy. Maybe it was the way he laughed too loudly at his own comments, or the way he ignored the waiters, or the way his eyes darted toward the door each time someone walked past, as though he expected something important to happen. She told herself to stay calm, to simply do her job and not to get curious, but curiosity has a way of growing stronger the more you try to ignore it. The evening unfolded slowly, drinks were ordered, dishes delivered, and the restaurant filled with quiet chatter. She moved between tables, always aware of the billionaire and his party at the corner. Their voices rose and fell, sometimes cheerful, sometimes sharp, like they were trying to keep disagreements from spilling out into the open. She caught fragments of English, bits of business talk, and then, surprisingly, Japanese. Her ears perked up. She hadn't heard Japanese spoken in a while, and it drew her attention instantly. The billionaire spoke the language clumsily, stumbling over words, mixing phrases with English, his accent heavy and unnatural. She felt a little smile tug at her lips. He was clearly trying to impress his companions, or perhaps to show off, but it was obvious he was not fluent. For a moment it was amusing, like watching someone pretend to know more than they did. But then she realized something strange. The associates he was speaking to didn't actually understand Japanese at all. They nodded along politely, eyes fixed on the papers in front of them, trusting every word that left his mouth. That was when the waitress felt the first flicker of suspicion. She didn't want to believe it yet. After all, why would a billionaire lie at a dinner table? What could possibly be at stake in a conversation like this? Still, she couldn't shake the thought. As she refilled their glasses and set down fresh plates, she glimpsed the papers on the table, the pages filled with neat Japanese text, contracts, or maybe official documents. She didn't stare for long, just enough to notice that the characters and the words didn't match what the man was saying. It sent a small shiver down her spine. She stepped back, pretending to focus on another table, but her mind kept returning to it. What if he was tricking them? What if the billionaire wasn't translating honestly? Her secret skill, the one she had carried quietly for years, suddenly seemed less like a hidden talent and more like a responsibility. She didn't know it yet, but this small moment of recognition would change her life, and his forever. The night went on, dishes were cleared, wine glasses filled, and the billionaire grew more confident. He laughed loudly, waved his hands, and pointed to different sections of the documents, saying things in English like, "This proves our profit margins," or "This is the clause that guarantees your return." His voice carried authority, the kind that made people listen without question. The waitress kept her head down, but inside she was watching, listening, every word sinking in. She wondered if she should say something, but the thought felt ridiculous. She was just a waitress, just someone bringing food and drinks, who would listen to her. And what if she was wrong? What if she had misread the words? Doubt whispered at her. But beneath it, a stronger truth pulsed. She knew Japanese, she knew what those papers said, and she knew he was not telling the truth. By the end of her shift, the atmosphere at that table had grown heavier. Deals were being sealed with handshakes, numbers scribbled in notepads, and glasses raised in celebration. The billionaire looked triumphant, his associates relieved. The waitress carried away the empty plates. Her hands steady but her mind racing. She didn't know what she would do yet, but deep inside she felt the stirrings of something she had never felt before, a sense that fate had placed her in the middle of something far bigger than an ordinary shift, something that could change everything. And though she didn't yet realize it, this quiet evening in the restaurant was not ordinary at all. It was the beginning of the end for a man whose empire was built on lies, and it all started with a waitress, standing silently, holding a secret that could bring him down. The dinner had moved past the first course, the glasses of wine were half empty, and the billionaire seemed more relaxed now. His laughter echoed through the restaurant, though it carried a sharp edge, like a man trying too hard to keep control of the room. The waitress kept moving between tables, her steps light, her eyes sharp. Every time she passed by the corner table, she noticed something new. On the table between the plates and glasses lay a neat stack of documents, thick sheets covered with Japanese characters. The papers looked official, printed with bold headings and careful formatting. The billionaire had placed them there almost like a trophy, his hand resting near the top page as if it was proof of his brilliance. His companions leaned in close, nodding, their faces lit by curiosity and a quiet sense of trust. The waitress knew enough about business dinners to understand what was happening. This wasn't just a meal. This was a meeting disguised as dinner, the kind of meeting where decisions worth millions were made between bites of steak and sips of wine. The billionaire had chosen this restaurant because it was private enough to keep conversations safe, yet luxurious enough to impress his guests. She carried a tray of appetizers to another table, but her ears were tuned to his voice. He spoke confidently, explaining the documents in English, his tone smooth, his words heavy with certainty. "This clause here guarantees full return within 6 months," he said, tapping the paper with his finger. "And here it shows the expansion rights in Tokyo." The guests murmured in agreement, eyes wide with the kind of excitement that comes when money feels close. But the waitress felt her stomach tighten, because she had glimpsed that very page earlier, when she leaned down to refill a glass. The section he pointed to didn't say anything about returns, nothing about guarantees. It was legal jargon about delivery schedules and standard procedures, boring details, not the promises he was spinning. She told herself it was none of her business, that she should walk away, but the words kept pressing on her mind. She moved closer again, carrying bread to the table next to theirs, and as she bent slightly, she saw another page, this one filled with kanji and polite business phrases. The billionaire spoke loudly about exclusive rights and international profits. But the text she saw spoke only of small distribution limits and restrictions, the kind of clauses that would protect one side, not enrich the other. Her pulse quickened. She realized he was not just clumsy with Japanese. He was deliberately twisting it, bending the meaning to suit his story. The associates had no way of knowing. They didn't understand a single word of the text. They relied fully on him. Their trust laid bare in the way they nodded and scribbled notes. She felt a strange mix of disbelief and anger. Here was a man with more money than she could imagine, and yet he was sitting in a restaurant lying through his teeth. She walked back to the kitchen, her hands steady on the tray, but inside she felt restless. Her mind spun with possibilities. Was she really seeing a fraud unfold in front of her? Could this be a scam worth millions, even billions? Her common sense told her to stay quiet, to keep her head down, because this was far above her. She was a waitress, nothing more, and men like him were untouchable. But another thought refused to leave her. What if this was bigger than just one dinner? What if his lies tonight ruined lives? What if people lost everything because of a contract they never truly understood? She tried to shake it off, forcing a smile at a couple celebrating a birthday at another table, lighting their candle, clapping with the others, but in the back of her mind, the papers burned like fire. When she returned to the billionaire's table, dessert menus in her hand, she caught a sharper glimpse of their expressions. The guests were leaning in, hanging on his every word, their pens moving quickly as they wrote down numbers he gave them, promises of profit, predictions of growth. Their trust was absolute. He had wrapped them in a web of confidence, and they didn't even know they were trapped. One of the men asked him a direct question. "Are you certain this guarantees protection against loss?" The billionaire smiled a slow smile. "Absolutely," he replied, tapping the document again. "The Japanese government itself has certified it." The waitress nearly dropped the menu in her hand, because she had just read the line he pointed at, and it was nothing more than a standard clause about meeting deadlines. No government guarantee, no protection, nothing. Her breath caught. She walked away before anyone noticed her face. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter in the kitchen. Her heart thumping hard against her ribs. She felt like she was standing on the edge of something dangerous. Her secret knowledge made her both powerful and vulnerable. She knew the truth, but speaking it could change everything. The night outside the restaurant grew darker. The city lights glittered like stars scattered across the streets, but inside, at that one table, a drama was unfolding that no one else could see. The billionaire laughed, poured more wine, his lies flowing smoother with every sip, and his guests smiled, believing they were walking into fortune. The waitress moved among the tables quietly, her mind torn between fear and conscience. She thought of the years she had spent learning Japanese, the hours of study, the countless mistakes corrected until the language became second nature. She had never once imagined it would matter in a place like this, in a restaurant where her job was only to serve and smile, and yet here she was, holding knowledge that could expose a lie worth $500 million. She paused at the doorway to the dining room, taking in the sight once more, the billionaire's confident gestures, the trusting faces of his associates, the silent stack of papers filled with truth he was burying under his words, and she realized, with a chill, that she could no longer call this just another shift. Something extraordinary was unfolding before her eyes, and whether she wanted it or not, she was now part of it. The suspicious documents on that table were not just paper. They were the key to uncovering a secret, a fraud so large it could shake the world of money and power. The waitress didn't yet know what she would do, but she felt the first stirrings of resolve, a quiet whisper inside telling her that the truth could not stay hidden forever, not if she had the courage to speak it. The dinner had stretched into its second hour, the plates were being cleared, the candles burned lower, and the wine kept flowing. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his confidence now filling the room like smoke, thick and hard to ignore. He was in his element, spinning stories, talking numbers, and pointing to the stack of Japanese documents as though they were golden keys to unlimited wealth. His guests were dazzled. They nodded, smiled, scribbled notes, and raised their glasses whenever he toasted to the future. The waitress kept moving through the restaurant, but her mind was locked on that one table. She had seen enough already to know he was lying. His words didn't match the text. His translations twisted the meaning of every sentence. At first she thought maybe he was being clever, exaggerating to make himself look stronger. But now she realized it was more than that. It was deliberate, cold, and dangerous. He was trying to sell them a lie so big it could cost hundreds of millions. Her heart raced. Each time she came near, she tried to act normal, pouring water, replacing plates, but her ears caught everything. The sound of his smooth voice, the questions of his guests, and then came the moment that changed everything. The billionaire was explaining a section of the contract, his finger tapping a bold line in the middle of the page. "This guarantees your investment will double within 6 months," he said, his tone dripping with certainty. The guests leaned forward, their eyes glowing with excitement. One of them whispered, "That's incredible." But the waitress's breath caught in her throat because she knew what that line said. She had read it quickly earlier. It wasn't about profit at all. It was a simple clause about shipping deadlines, a boring logistical detail, nothing about doubling money, nothing about returns. It was a lie so obvious to her, but invisible to them. She froze for a second, her hand gripping the edge of her tray, her mind screaming, should she speak? Should she stay quiet? She looked around. No one else in the restaurant knew. No one else could see through him. She was the only one, just a waitress, standing in silence with the truth burning inside her. The billionaire didn't notice her hesitation. He kept talking, piling lie on top of lie, his words growing bolder. And this here, he said, pointing again, shows that the Japanese government has officially approved this deal. It's as safe as a bank. The guests clapped softly. One even leaned back with a sigh of relief, clearly convinced. That was when it slipped out, soft at first, almost like a whisper. The waitress shook her head and muttered under her breath. That's not what it says. She hadn't meant to speak. The words escaped her like air escaping from a balloon, unplanned, unstoppable. But in the quiet moment between conversations, everyone heard. The billionaire's head snapped up, his sharp eyes locking onto her. The guests turned too, confused. The waitress felt her face grow warm. She wanted to disappear, to swallow her words, but it was too late. They had all heard her. The silence stretched long and heavy, as though the entire room was waiting for what would come next. What did you say? The billionaire asked, his voice calm but dangerous, like the surface of water hiding sharp rocks beneath. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly, but then she met his eyes and spoke clearer, stronger this time. That's not what it says, sir. The document doesn't say what you told them. A gasp went around the table. The guests shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between the waitress and the billionaire. The billionaire let out a short laugh, forced and brittle. She must be mistaken, he said, waving his hand as though swatting away a fly. She probably doesn't know what she's talking about. But the waitress stood her ground, her voice calm, her Japanese rolling off her tongue perfectly as she read the line out loud, translating it word for word into English. This clause is about delivery schedules. It has nothing to do with investment returns. The room froze. The guests blinked in surprise, their trust beginning to crack. The billionaire's smile faltered for just a moment, quick but visible, the kind of slip that revealed the truth beneath his mask. He recovered quickly, leaning forward with forced charm. It's a misunderstanding, a small mistake. These documents are complex. I was only simplifying for you, he insisted, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. The waitress stepped back, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. She hadn't planned this, hadn't wanted this, but once the words were spoken, there was no turning back. The air in the room had changed. The guests were no longer nodding blindly. Now they were frowning, their pens still, their eyes sharper. One of the associates leaned toward her. You can read Japanese? He asked, disbelief in his tone. She nodded, her voice steady. Yes, fluently, she replied. And I know what these documents say. The guests exchanged uneasy glances, suspicion filling their eyes as they turned back to the billionaire. For the first time that evening, the billionaire looked cornered, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming against the table, his charm no longer enough to hide the tension. He glared at the waitress, his voice low and sharp. You should mind your own business. He hissed, but the damage was already done. The guests demanded clarification. One of them pushed the documents closer to her. Read this line, he said, his voice firm. The billionaire tried to stop them, reaching across the table, but it was too late. The waitress leaned in, her voice ringing clear. She translated another section, exposing yet another lie. The silence that followed was even heavier than before. The billionaire's mask cracked again, sweat visible on his forehead. The guests sat stiff in their chairs, the glow of excitement gone, replaced by suspicion and a creeping sense of betrayal. The waitress straightened, her hands still shaking, but inside her a strange courage had begun to grow. She hadn't wanted to speak, but now that she had, she realized she couldn't stop, because once the truth starts slipping out, it has a way of breaking through every wall, no matter how high or strong. And tonight, one slip of the tongue had just pulled the first brick from the billionaire's empire of lies. The restaurant buzzed faintly with other conversations, but at that corner table, time felt frozen, everyone waiting, watching, as the power in the room began to shift, away from the billionaire and toward the quiet young waitress who had dared to speak. The moment hung heavy in the air. The guests stared at the waitress. The billionaire forced a smile, but the corners of his lips twitched, betraying the storm brewing behind his calm mask. The restaurant around them carried on with soft chatter, and the clinking of glasses, Yet at that corner table the world felt narrowed to silence. Every eye fixed on the young woman who had dared to interrupt. She felt her knees tremble slightly, but she stood firm. Her voice steady though her heart pounded against her ribs. She repeated the words more clearly this time. "That's not what it says?" She gestured politely toward the documents, her tone respectful but unshakable. "This line, it speaks only about delivery dates, nothing about profit, nothing about doubling investments." The guests shifted in their seats, confusion spreading like wildfire. One of them leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief but also hope, as though he desperately wanted clarity. The waitress nodded once, calm and certain. "Yes, I'm fluent in Japanese. I studied for years. I can read every line." The billionaire laughed then, a hollow, brittle laugh that echoed too loudly. "She's just a waitress?" he scoffed, waving his hand as though brushing dust off his sleeve. "You cannot take her seriously, she must have misunderstood." But his voice cracked slightly on the last word, and the guests noticed. One of the men pushed the papers toward her, his eyes locked on hers. "Read it for us," he said firmly. The billionaire's hand shot out, quick and sharp, snatching the document back. "This is highly confidential," he said, his tone sharp enough to cut. "She has no right." But the damage was already done, his desperation was showing. The waitress took a slow breath. She had not meant to step into the storm, but now she was in the center of it. Her voice carried across the table again, soft but unwavering. She recited the Japanese line perfectly, then translated it into English, her words clear and precise. It says, "The products must be delivered within 60 days of agreement. Any delay beyond this will result in penalties." She paused, meeting their eyes. "That's all, nothing more." The silence after her words was deafening. The guests looked at one another, their trust faltering, doubt creeping into their eyes like shadows. One of them clenched his jaw, his pen forgotten in his hand. The billionaire leaned back, his face stiff, his smile gone. His fingers drumming on the table as though he could drum away the truth. He tried again, his voice lower, almost soothing. "Gentlemen, you must understand, in business we simplify, we make things easier for everyone. What she read is the technical detail, what I tell you is the meaning, the spirit of the contract." But even as he spoke, his words rang hollow, like glass ready to shatter. The waitress felt their eyes turn back to her. Searching, questioning, one of them asked softly, "Could you check another section?" She hesitated, glancing at the billionaire whose stare burned into her like fire. But then she nodded. "Yes," she whispered, her hands steady now, her fear melting into resolve. Another page was slid toward her, this time not hidden, not shielded. The billionaire clenched his fists but said nothing, his jaw tight. She read it carefully, her voice firm. "This section speaks about distribution limits. It states that sales must not exceed a certain quota without further approval. It does not say anything about exclusive rights or guaranteed expansion." Her eyes lifted, calm. "Again, it's not what he told you." Gasps, whispers, uneasy shifting in chairs. The atmosphere at the table had transformed completely. The guests no longer leaned toward the billionaire with admiration. They leaned back, their eyes wary, their hands pulling slightly away from the papers, as if afraid they might burn. The billionaire's mask cracked further. A drop of sweat glistened at his temple. He grabbed his glass and swallowed hard. His charm drained away, his voice louder now, harsher. "This is nonsense. She is trying to embarrass me. She is lying." But no one believed him as easily anymore. His power over the room was slipping. The waitress stood quietly, not pushing, not boasting, only answering the questions put before her. Her calm voice became a steady light in the growing storm. Each word she spoke tore another thread from the web of lies he had spun. The guests turned on him, their questions sharper, their tone no longer trusting. "Why would you misrepresent this?" one demanded. "If this is legitimate, why not let her read it aloud?" Another pressed. The billionaire tried to answer, but his words stumbled, excuses tripping over themselves, his confidence gone. The waitress felt the weight of what she had done. She had broken the silence, spoken the truth, and now the balance of power had shifted. She was just a waitress, a quiet worker in a fine restaurant, but tonight she had pierced the armor of a billionaire. And though she didn't fully understand the scale of his scheme, She knew one thing for certain: the truth was out, and it could not be shoved back into the shadows. The rest of the restaurant carried on with their meals, unaware that in one corner a fortune's foundation was crumbling. But at that table, everything had changed. The guests no longer looked at the billionaire as a visionary. They looked at him as a liar, and they looked at the waitress as the one person who had dared to reveal it. The billionaire leaned forward once more, his voice cold now, stripped of charm. "You will regret this," he muttered under his breath, meant only for her. But she did not flinch. She simply stood straight, meeting his gaze with quiet courage, because in that moment, she understood. The power of truth didn't need wealth, didn't need status. It only needed someone willing to speak it. And as the night dragged on, as more pages were questioned, as more lies unraveled, the billionaire's empire of confidence began to collapse. All because one waitress had dared to say, "That's not what it says." In perfect Japanese, breaking open a secret he had built an empire upon. The restaurant no longer felt calm. The billionaire's laughter had died. His charm had faded, and the air around the table was thick with unease. The guests who had arrived full of excitement now sat stiff in their chairs, their eyes darting between the waitress and the man they had once trusted without question. The room still glowed with soft lights. The clink of glasses from other tables carried on. But at this corner, the atmosphere had changed completely. The billionaire shifted in his chair, his hand gripping the edge of the table a little too tightly. He tried to regain control, his voice louder now, sharper. "Gentlemen, you are letting a waitress distract you," he said, forcing a smile that no longer looked convincing. "She doesn't understand the full context. These documents are complex. I am simply giving you the essence." But the guests were no longer nodding along, they were frowning. Their pens idle, doubt carving lines into their faces. One of the guests leaned back, his arms crossed, his eyes narrowed. "Then why does her translation sound so exact?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Another nodded slowly. "She reads Japanese fluently. Your version and hers don't match. Which one should we believe?" The billionaire's jaw tightened, his charm slipping further. He waved his hand dismissively. "She is twisting words to embarrass me, nothing more." The waitress stood still, her hands folded before her. Not pushing, not boasting, just waiting. She had already spoken the truth. She didn't need to add more unless asked, and that silence gave her even more power. The guests could see she had nothing to gain, no reason to lie. While the billionaire's desperate defense looked thinner with every passing second, the billionaire reached for his glass, gulping down wine too quickly, a small tremor in his hand betraying the panic he was trying to hide. He slammed the glass down harder than he meant to, the sound echoing across the table. His associates glanced nervously at each other, their faces pale. They had been following him blindly for years, but now even they were beginning to wonder if everything was built on lies. The waitress was asked again to read. Another section was slid toward her. She leaned slightly, her voice calm and steady. "This paragraph is about penalties for delays. It does not say anything about government approval or guaranteed profits," she said clearly. The guests stiffened, their faces darkening. One muttered, "Unbelievable." Under his breath, the billionaire's mask cracked further. Sweat glistened on his forehead. He leaned forward, his tone desperate. "You don't understand. In business we use simplified terms. My explanation is the truth. Hers is just words on paper." But his excuses only deepened the suspicion. The more he spoke, the more obvious his fear became. The guests began to press harder, their voices no longer polite. "Show us proof," one demanded. "If this is legitimate, why not let her translate the entire thing?" Another insisted. The billionaire raised his voice, his hands slamming on the table. "Because she is lying," he barked, his sudden anger shocking the entire table. The other diners in the restaurant even glanced over for a moment before returning awkwardly to their meals. Sensing tension they didn't understand. The waitress felt her chest tighten, but she didn't step back. She didn't flinch. She stood calm, her quiet presence making his anger look even more unhinged. She repeated softly, "I am not lying. I am only reading what is written." The contrast between his fury and her calm only widened the gap of trust. The guests leaned away from him, their eyes turning to her with something that looked like respect. One of the guests whispered to another, "If she's right, we've been tricked." The words were like sparks in dry grass. Panic spread across their faces. They realized how close they had come to signing something that could ruin them. Their trust in the billionaire cracked, falling apart piece by piece. The billionaire's empire of confidence crumbling before their eyes. He tried one last tactic, leaning back, forcing a smile, his voice soft again. "Gentlemen, we've known each other for years, you know me. Do you really think I would risk everything with a lie?" But even as he spoke, his eyes flicked toward the waitress, filled with fury and fear, and the guests caught it. His mask was gone, his desperation naked. The waitress lowered her gaze for a moment, her heart pounding. She hadn't wanted this. She had only spoken because she couldn't let the lies continue. Now the entire table had turned into a battlefield, and she was in the middle of it. But somewhere deep inside, she felt a quiet strength. The truth was on her side, and it gave her courage she never knew she had. The billionaire's associates whispered frantically, one urging him to calm down, another trying to distract the guests with small talk. But it was useless, the damage was done. The guests no longer looked at him as a visionary. They looked at him as a fraud, and fear began to creep into their voices too, fear of losing money, fear of being caught in a scandal. The billionaire stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor, his face flushed with anger. "This is finished," he declared, gathering the papers in a rush, shoving them into his briefcase. "We will meet again in my office, not here." But the guests didn't move. One of them raised a hand, his voice calm but firm. "No, not until we know the truth," he said. The billionaire froze, realizing his grip on them was slipping completely. The waitress stood a step back, silent now, but her earlier words echoed in the minds of everyone at that table. "That's not what it says." The phrase that had torn apart the web of lies. The guests whispered among themselves, their trust shattered, their confidence gone, their eyes cold with suspicion. The billionaire sat back down slowly, forced by their stares. His face a mask of barely controlled rage. Inside him panic swirled, because he knew in that moment, the fortress of lies he had built over years had been cracked open, and it had started not by a rival businessman, not by an investigator, but by a waitress, standing with a tray in her hands and the truth on her tongue. And as the night dragged on, the tension at the table never faded, questions kept coming, doubts grew louder, and for the first time in years, the billionaire felt something he had almost forgotten, the cold grip of fear, real fear, as the walls of his empire began to close in around him. The night ended awkwardly. The billionaire forced himself to smile as he gathered his papers, but the shine in his eyes was gone. His guests no longer laughed or raised glasses. They whispered instead. There. Voices sharp, their expressions dark. When they finally left the restaurant, the billionaire stormed out first, his steps heavy, his associates trailing behind him with pale faces. The waitress stood near the counter, pretending to tidy a tray, but her heart knew something had shifted forever. The guests did not forget what had happened. The very next morning, one of them made a quiet phone call to a trusted lawyer. Another sent copies of the documents to a financial advisor in Tokyo. Within hours, questions began to swirl. Legal terms were checked, clauses compared, translations verified. The truth spread quickly. The billionaire had twisted every line. His grand promises were smoke and mirrors. His empire was a castle built on sand. The waitress returned to her normal shift, carrying plates and smiling politely. But whispers followed her. The manager had heard what happened, the staff too. They spoke in hushed tones in the kitchen, half fearful, half amazed. She really said it, right in front of him. One cook muttered, "Do you know who that man is?" Another whispered back. She stayed quiet, not seeking attention, but deep inside she knew that the truth she had spoken was rolling forward like a stone that could not be stopped. Days later, the news broke quietly. Then loudly, reporters began circling, whispers of fraud spread across business circles. Investors demanded explanations. Regulators started pulling threads. What they found shocked even those who thought they had seen everything. The billionaire had orchestrated fake deals worth $500 million. Using false translations, manipulated contracts, and blind trust. It all traced back to that dinner, that moment when a waitress spoke up. Investigators arrived in expensive suits, sitting with the guests who had been there that night. They asked questions, demanded details, wanted every word remembered, and again the same phrase came up. she said. That's not what it says. It became the starting point, the spark that lit the fire of inquiry. The billionaire tried to fight back. He called his lawyers, he held press conferences. He insisted it was all a misunderstanding. My translations were simplified for business partners, nothing more, he declared. But the evidence mounted against him. Emails surfaced, bank transfers revealed strange patterns, old contracts showed the same tricks. It was not simplification, it was deception, carefully planned and repeated. The waitress never expected to be involved, but soon she was contacted too. Men in dark suits approached her politely, asking if she would answer questions. She sat nervously in a small office, explaining how she had read the lines, how she had recognized the lies. Her voice steady even as her hands trembled slightly. The investigators listened closely, writing down every word. Her testimony became a thread in a larger net. A net that tightened around the billionaire day by day. Soon the headlines screamed, "Billionaire under investigation for $500 million fraud." Photos of him leaving court flashed across screens. His once proud smile replaced by tight lips and downcast eyes. The world that had worshipped him as a genius now whispered his name with suspicion and anger. Meanwhile, the waitress kept working. The restaurant busier now with curious customers who wanted to see the place where the scandal had begun. Some of them whispered to her. Some asked bold questions, but she always answered kindly, never seeking fame. She had not spoken to become a hero. She had only spoken because she couldn't bear the lie. The guests who had nearly been trapped in his scheme felt both relief and shame. Relief that they had been saved before it was too late. Shame that they had trusted so blindly. One of them even returned to the restaurant weeks later, finding the waitress on her shift. He shook her hand firmly and said, "You saved us, we owe you." She only smiled softly, replying, "I just told the truth." The investigation widened. Regulators across countries began tracing his business. Companies distanced themselves. Stockholders sold their shares. The empire he had built over decades crumbled faster than anyone could have imagined. The turning point was not a grand expose by a rival, not a hidden recording by a journalist, but the quiet voice of a waitress who spoke in perfect Japanese. The billionaire's fury grew. He tried to paint himself as a victim, claiming he was betrayed, claiming his words had been twisted. But every time he spoke, the memory of that dinner returned to the minds of those who had seen it. The image of him silenced by a young woman who simply read the truth. The waitress never bragged, never sought cameras, but the world spoke of her anyway. Journalists wrote stories about her bravery. Bloggers praised her honesty. People debated how one small act of courage could topple the powerful. Her name became known far beyond the walls of that restaurant. Though she herself continued to live simply, still walking between tables with trays in her hands, still offering polite smiles to strangers, but she carried something new inside her. A quiet strength. The knowledge that truth matters, that sometimes the smallest voice can pierce the loudest lies. And she knew, though the investigation was far from over, that the path had already been set. The billionaire who once seemed untouchable was now cornered. His lies dragged into the light, his empire trembling, and it had all begun with one simple sentence spoken on an ordinary night, in an ordinary restaurant, by someone no one had expected to matter. "That's not what it says," the waitress had said, and from those 5 words, an investigation had begun that would change everything. The billionaire had spent years building his reputation. His face appeared on magazine covers. His name was spoken in boardrooms as if it meant genius. People admired his wealth, his cars, his mansions. His power seemed endless. But in the weeks after the dinner, everything began to fall apart piece by piece. The investigation grew larger every day. The lies he had told in that restaurant were only the surface of something far bigger. And now the world was seeing the truth he had tried to bury. Reporters camped outside his offices. Cameras flashed whenever he appeared. Questions were shouted at him as he walked quickly into buildings. No longer smiling, no longer waving. He avoided the eyes of the world. His lawyers surrounded him, whispering urgently, trying to shield him. But even they knew the walls were closing in. The documents were checked again and again. Experts confirmed what the waitress had said. The contracts contained nothing of the promises he had made. The translations were twisted lies. Regulators discovered entire networks of fake companies. Money flowing in circles to make it look real. But underneath it was all empty. The empire was a stage set, grand and glittering from the outside, but hollow inside. His investors turned against him. Men who once shook his hand with admiration now refused to return his calls. Banks demanded answers. Partners withdrew quietly. The billionaire who once walked into rooms commanding respect now walked into rooms filled with suspicion. The confidence in his voice was gone, his eyes restless, his hands unsteady. The trial came quickly, faster than anyone had expected. The evidence was overwhelming. Prosecutors spoke of false deals, manipulated papers, stolen trust. The courtroom was filled with people who had once believed in him. Some of them had lost fortunes, their faces bitter, their voices sharp as they testified. One by one they told the story of how they had been misled, how they had trusted the man who now sat silently at the defendant's table. The waitress was called too. She entered quietly, nervous but steady. The room hushed when she took her seat. She told her story simply, no drama, no exaggeration. She explained how she had overheard his false translations, how she had read the lines aloud, how the guests reacted. Her words were calm, honest, unshakable. The jury watched her closely, and in their eyes it was clear, they believed her. The billionaire tried to defend himself. He spoke of misunderstandings, he blamed miscommunication. He even suggested the waitress had embarrassed him on purpose. But his words sounded weak, empty, his once powerful voice now thin, no longer carrying the weight it once had. The truth pressed down on him from every angle, and he could not escape. The verdict came, guilty on multiple counts of fraud. The billionaire who had once seemed untouchable was led away in handcuffs. The cameras outside caught every moment. The man who once stepped into limousines now stepped into a prison van. His head lowered, his face pale. The empire he had built crumbled in front of the entire nation. The world reacted with shock. Headlines shouted his downfall. People debated how such a powerful man could be undone. Some said it was greed. Others said it was arrogance. But one detail always stood out. It had started with a single waitress, a quiet voice that spoke the truth when no one else dared. In the restaurant, life carried on, but nothing felt the same. People whispered when they saw her. Some called her brave, some called her foolish, but all of them knew she had changed something far beyond the walls of that dining room. She had cracked open a $500 million scam with nothing more than honesty. The billionaire's homes were seized, his cars sold, his name erased from buildings that once bore it proudly. The empire that once glittered across cities now lay in ruins, and he sat behind bars. His fortune gone, his reputation destroyed. The mighty man brought low not by rivals or enemies, but by the truth. The waitress sometimes thought back to that night, to the moment she spoke the words she hadn't planned to say. She realized now that courage doesn't always come in grand speeches. Sometimes it comes in a quiet voice, a single sentence spoken at the right time, and she felt no regret. For the billionaire, the fall was complete. His name became a warning, a lesson told in newspapers and classrooms, a story of how lies can carry a man high but truth will always pull him down. And for the waitress, her life continued, simple, ordinary, yet forever touched by the night when the world shifted because she chose to speak. And so, the fall of the billionaire was not just his own. It was a reminder to everyone watching that power built on lies is never as strong as it seems, and sometimes, it only takes one honest voice to bring it crashing to the ground. When the billionaire was finally locked away, the noise of the trial slowly faded. The newspapers printed his name less often. The cameras turned their attention to other scandals, but for the people whose lives he had touched with his lies, the aftermath was long and heavy. Some had lost money they would never see again. Some had lost trust that could not be rebuilt, and all of them carried the memory of how close they had come to being destroyed by greed. The guests from that dinner returned to their lives, but not without scars. They had been humiliated, tricked into almost signing away fortunes. Their reputations had been stained. Yet in private they admitted again and again that they had been saved, not by lawyers or investigators, but by a waitress, a young woman who had no reason to risk herself, no reason to step into their world of wealth and power, and yet she did, with one simple sentence. The waitress herself tried to return to normal. She tied her apron, carried trays, and smiled at strangers just as she always had. But her life would never truly be the same. Customers whispered when they saw her. Some pointed, some offered kind words. A few even asked for photos as though she were a celebrity. She always laughed softly, shaking her head, insisting she was no hero, just someone who could not keep silent when she saw a lie. Reporters tried to chase her, offering interviews, Television stations wanted her face on screen. Book publishers sent her letters asking if she would tell her story, but she turned most of them away. She did not want fame. She did not want to be the center of attention. All she wanted was peace, to live quietly, to carry her small victory in her heart without turning it into a spectacle. Still, her story traveled. People shared it on social media. Headlines repeated her words. That's not what it says. The sentence that had toppled an empire. It became a phrase people repeated when they spoke about honesty. It became a symbol of courage, proof that truth, no matter how small, could bring down even the most powerful lies. In schools, teachers told her story to students, reminding them that knowledge matters, that integrity matters, that sometimes the world changes not through grand actions but through small acts of bravery. In offices, workers whispered about her when bosses pushed too far. In cafes, strangers argued about whether they too would have spoken if they were in her place. The billionaire, once admired, now sat in prison. His name spoken only with anger or pity, his empire broken, his friends gone, his wealth scattered. He was a reminder of how quickly power can vanish when it is built on lies. He had dreamed of being remembered as a genius, but instead he became a cautionary tale, a warning etched into history. The waitress, on the other hand, carried on, her life simple but filled with quiet dignity. She knew the world had changed around her, but inside she stayed the same. She was not rich, she was not famous, but she was free, free from regret, free from shame, and that freedom felt more valuable than any amount of money. Sometimes she thought back to the moment she spoke, the way the words slipped from her mouth without planning, the way silence had fallen, the way the billionaire's mask had cracked. She realized now that it had been fate, or maybe just courage she didn't know she had, and she smiled at the thought that one ordinary night had become extraordinary. Her story inspired others. People wrote letters to her, thanking her for reminding them that honesty still had power in a world filled with lies. Some even confessed their own stories of speaking up, of daring to tell the truth when no one else would. Her simple act became a ripple, and that ripple spread far beyond the walls of the restaurant. The city eventually forgot the details, as cities always do. New scandals appeared, new headlines took over, but the legend remained, the waitress who spoke perfect Japanese, the waitress who exposed a billionaire's $500 million scam, the waitress who reminded everyone that truth needs no title, no wealth, no permission. And in the quiet of her life, when the rush of the restaurant slowed, when the last tables emptied and the lights dimmed, she would sometimes pause and breathe deeply, knowing she had lived through something few could imagine, knowing she had carried the weight of truth in her hands and set it free. She didn't need applause, she didn't need recognition. The world had already been changed, even if just a little, by her voice. The billionaire's fall was the end of one story, but her courage was the beginning of another. A story that would live on in whispers, in classrooms, in quiet conversations, reminding people everywhere that lies, no matter how grand, can be broken by truth, no matter how small. And so the legacy of that night lived on. The empire of deceit lay in ruins, but the simple courage of one young woman stood tall, shining quietly in the memory of everyone who heard the story. Proof that even in a world ruled by power and money, sometimes, all it takes to change everything is a single voice saying, "That's not what it says."